Welcome to all. I'm Nandita and I'm joined here with my colleagues at the Foundation for Democratic Reforms. So, as we know, 2023 has come to an end and it has been a very eventful year with many moments scattered across the months. So, we thought that it would be interesting to examine some of those events and analyze its impact on India as well as the world. So, to discuss this with us, here we have Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. He is a former civil servant and the founder of the Lok Satta movement, and he's the founder of our organization as well. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Nandita, and welcome to all of you.
Okay. So, to start off, I thought it would be interesting to analyze the world situation as a whole. So, there have been some recent election results in the Latin America as well as the Europe, which have suggested the rise of the right wing. And we have seen a similar situation in India as well with the recent elections. So, what can you say about the seeming link between this phenomenon as well as the rising sentiments such as hyper-nationalism, isolationism, as well as increasing support for movements such as anti-immigration? And what can you say about the link with that and with the Indian political scenario as well?
You put together three different strands, as I said. One is the economic strand. Take, for instance, the recent election result in Argentina. It's largely because of the frustration on account of economic mismanagement of the country, 140% inflation and so on and so forth. And of course, division between two relatively conservative politicians with a somewhat similar vision. And therefore, one of them elbowed out even in the earlier stage. So that's one strand. The second strand is the cultural and demographic strand, a sense of insecurity on account of demographic changes. Certain groups, the population is stagnating or even diminishing. Some other groups' population increasing on account of either birth rates or immigration. And therefore, all kinds of fears. And third is immigration itself provokes many fears and uncertainties and insecurities, both economic and cultural. I think we must deconstruct them. While the net impact may be an integrated one together, but to understand, we must deconstruct. If you take the economic part of it, it's more or less a cyclical phenomena. There was a time immediately after the Second World War when much of the world was enamored by the Soviet experiment, the seeming success of large infrastructure, large industry, and who doesn't want equality of outcomes? I mean, this human nature, right? We all want to enjoy the fruits of all human development. It's a very natural expectation. But the 70s onwards, or perhaps 80s onwards, the world realized that unless there is individual incentive for prosperity, for economic growth, for wealth creation, and a framework to ensure that everybody has an opportunity irrespective of the circumstances of birth. So there is a merger of two principles: wealth creation based on economic freedom, liberty, competition, and choice, and opportunity irrespective of birth, which provides a framework for everybody to grow through the state action. Europe has been in the forefront of that, and much of the developed world and civilized world embraced that. Unfortunately, in the last 20, 30 years, some of these settled issues have been reopened because of sub-regional and regional inequalities in the globe. If you take trade, China has become such a behemoth. Many other countries are now terrified. America and other countries which actually propagated free trade now are worried about it because they lost manufacturing jobs. They exported jobs in effect. Consumers are happy, but the producers are unhappy. And ultimately, you can't have producers unhappy and consumers happy for long. There has to be some kind of a resolution of that. So many things that appear to be fairly well settled, this beautiful combination of economic growth to entrepreneurship and economic freedom, and reasonable welfare measures to give everybody an opportunity, that has now broken down. I think this is the convulsion that we see. And that is combined with added insecurities on account of breathtakingly rapid technological advances. Take the whole computer era. What's happened? In the manufacturing era, people with reasonable level of skills, but not very high level of skills, some school education, got a pretty decent job. They were always confident that their lives are better than their predecessors, their parents. For the first time in the West, the younger people are no longer confident that their lives are going to be better than their parents. And this is completely against modernity. The last 400-500 years, there's one axiomatic thing that the children's lives will be better than the parents' lives. Take India, for instance. Each of us, whatever be the generation, we can genuinely claim that our lives are better than our parents' lives because we're in the growth phase. In the West, it's no longer true. And increasingly, wealth is concentrated because of the aggregator effect of the technology. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few people who have the capital and who can marshal the intellectual capital, the big companies, and the professionals who have high level of skills and therefore can partake in modern economic activity. The rest of them are increasingly marginalized. The pandemic actually accelerated this process, and thereby the semi-skilled, unskilled people, they're much worse off, whereas the skilled people and professionals and companies are much better off. You have never seen such divergence. So there are tremendous consequences on account of this economic trajectory in politics and society. And I think that conversion is what we are seeing right now. And the other two factors, as I mentioned, whether it is immigration or the cultural factors. My belief is Karl Marx may have been wrong on many things, but his fundamental precept that economics dictates politics and society, and in a large measure, history, I think he was broadly on target. So these are byproducts of economic insecurities. After all, earlier, 30, 40 years ago, the American whites were never afraid of the future, the demographic changes. But now the economic insecurities deepen this, and some people always use that as an opportunity to propagate certain ideologies. Similarly, immigration is again a function of economics. Why will people immigrate? And if you immigrate, why do people resist? There was a time when America welcomed immigration. They wanted immigrants. Today, they don't want. Because if economically the dominant sections don't feel secure enough, then immigration becomes a major problem. So I think a lot of it is related to a certain breakdown of the consensus in the world about economic management in the nation states and perhaps even in terms of global trade. Hopefully, in the next 10, 15 years, there'll be some kind of a stability. But right now, we're at the peak of instability because artificial intelligence, if anything, is further deepening this divide and making it more complex. Each of us is insecure. Take Indian IT workers in the last 10, 15 years or 20 years. The biggest employer for Indian middle classes was the information technology. Now, many people are worried, I don't know to what extent those fears are justified, that artificial intelligence, etc., they may decimate millions of jobs. So I think this convulsion will probably continue for some more years until some kind of a stability in terms of technology, economic management, they happen. There is some evidence to show that technology is actually improving lives and prosperity across the world. If the nation states act with reasonable degree of diligence and with some foresight and some restraint, then I think countries are going to prosper, at least the poorer and middle income countries. And to that extent, I think there'll be greater social stability and political stability.
Okay, so from this we can kind of understand that from the fears of economic instability, it has clearly affected people's sentiments, and that has led to a lot of political impact as well. So that kind of attributes a lot of importance to the impact of the people and what they think, and basically about their opinions. In the age of social media, like, a lot of importance has been given to that. But despite that, so in 2023, we have also seen the inflamed state of the Israel-Palestine conflict coming to another thing. And despite this importance given to people's opinions, that there has been a lot of rising sentiment for maybe, like, a ceasefire of sorts, because we have also seen the devastation of a lot of Palestinian citizens in a massacre of sorts. But despite this rising sentiment, nothing has been done to stop it, despite claims of a multipolar world. So, what can you say about the instability of the
I think they
international
cannot
order?
be explained on economic logic alone. You take Palestinian problem, it's the legacy of history.
Yeah,
Many of us
definitely.
understand the unique set of circumstances. And perhaps in the last 20 years or so, Mr. Netanyahu was allowed to get away with the notion that there's no need to have a two-state solution to Palestinian problem. While in the short term that served his interests, in the long term that was always a powder keg. On top of it, unfortunately, the moderate, sensible, visionary leadership of Palestine gave way to the reckless, bigoted, extremely dangerous marauders in the form of Hamas, etc. So this combination is now playing havoc there. It's nothing to do with global economy or global forces. Whereas Russia, the loss of an empire and a relative economic decline. Russia is now a middle level power. If you take away the massive arsenal of ICBMs, what does Russia have? Its economy is about 2.5 trillion. It's almost half of India's or 60% of India's, and will be much smaller as a percentage in the coming years compared to us. Militarily, outside of these strategic weapons, they are just a middling power. And economically, they're inconsequential, and they lost the sense of that superpower now, their empire, which they had it well before the communist revolution, right from Tsarist times. So it's more that. And another thing which might develop is again China, unresolved problems, the territory of Taiwan, etc. So I think these are unrelated to economic management and normal other social or political developments. And hopefully, in the next 20, 25 years, such problems will be resolved much more sensibly. But the world is now paying a price, and particularly the communities that are suffering, whether the Israeli people who are butchered by the Hamas terrorists, or the innocent Palestinians who are now the collateral damage because of Israeli bombing, or the Ukrainian people who are fighting very bravely and heroically, but paying an extraordinary price to preserve freedom and their own national identity. I think all these are paying the enormous price. Let's hope global community will figure out a set of solutions over a period of time. The only solace we have as humankind is, while all these are horrific, if we take the long trajectory of history, generationally speaking, the world is much more peaceful, much less violent, much less brutal than it was. It's not enough of a consolation, but we must derive hope from the fact that the world is actually getting better despite all these horrific instances.
Okay, just one more follow-up question to that. So, can we attribute that to then the rise of just the fact that a lot of the conflicts that had been put to rest temporarily are again rising? Can we attribute that to the rise of identity politics
I
then?
don't know if there are many such conflicts that are now rising afresh.
But the so Israel Palestine is one definitely, and then the Russia Ukraine, and as you mentioned, China with Taiwan, and also the conflict going on in the Republic of Congo. So all of that combined.
Agreed. But if you take Africa as a whole, 20, 25 years ago, Africa did not seem peaceful like this. Today, Africa is an emerging continent.
Definitely.
Not only growing demographically, but economically, it's very vibrant. 6 to 7% growth in Africa, many countries, is no longer the exception. It's pretty much the norm. It's only get better. Yes, Congo is still a problem. So, in that sense, I think actually the world is getting better. Conflict is getting much to be much less. As I said, it's hardly any solace to the people who are paying the humongous price in terms of their blood and sweat and tears. But if you take the global picture, things are not as dismal as they appear to be. But we have a lot more to do to ensure decent living and peace and harmony in pockets of the world. So I am optimistic in the broader term, in the longer term.
Okay, thank you.
So, in light of what Nandita mentioned, the events across the year, these events have triggered divisive views in the public discourse. And most importantly, there seems to be a growing sense of intolerance for those opposing views to the person or the subject in person. And in a democratic society, how do we discourage such rhetoric which doesn't respect differing perspectives?
Sriniket, this is a tough question, particularly at this time of history. I think our own technological advances, the social media, 24-hour instant communication, and highly decentralized democratic communication. No, an idiot has the same power as an Einstein in terms of communication today. A century ago, a Mahatma Gandhi's moral voice was heard loud and clear above every other voice. And Einstein's voice was heard. Today, an absolute bigot and an idiot is heard as loudly as Mahatma Gandhi and Einstein. So, in other words, the filters have disappeared. While it empowered us, it liberated us, it's exhilarating, it's also quite a bit of a problem. I don't have an answer. What I'm hoping is that in coming years, human society together, because this cannot be solved at a nation state level, because most of this technology is transnational. It is global. So even if you wish to, there's no easy mechanism for the national sovereignty to assert itself in order to ensure that the bad communication, bad as bigoted, promoting hatred and violence, very unscientific and dangerous ideas, so on and so forth. I don't really see an easy answer, but I'm hoping that global community will figure out a set of practical solutions at a transnational level to address that. Unless that is addressed, I don't see how this bigotry and polarization are going to decrease. But within nation states, also there is a high degree of polarization. Take two instances, India, United States. Two democracies of different levels of evolution, both are genuinely free, robust, but with India flawed, and increasingly in America also we say a flawed democracy. We didn't use that expression earlier in America. I think the conditions are different. While the outcome is somewhat similar in terms of polarization and too much of noise and so on and so forth, in America, two factors have added to this. One is an excessive democracy in parties in the form of primary elections, whereby you have to only appeal to the fellow travelers who already agree with you. And therefore, you go to the extreme to be dominant in the party, not really bring the society, various groups together in society. Ideally, a primary election is a wonderful thing, right? It gives power to the members, not to the party bosses. But perhaps, while party internal democracy is absolutely critical, we have to design better methods whereby the appeal is not going to be to the extremists but to the middle of the roaders. We have to design that. The second is, unlike, for instance, India, in America, the constituencies, the American Congress, the federal Congress, equivalent of our Lok Sabha, the boundaries are decided by each state legislature entirely through political machinations. So gerrymandering, redistricting the boundaries to suit their political advantage has become endemic. So once you have gerrymandering with primary elections, compromise is dead. To my mind, that is the central feature of American political crisis. Apart from the demographic and other insecurities, economic insecurities that the lower middle class whites feel in much of the country, we discussed it earlier. But politically, institutionally, there is a problem. American democracy is so consumed by many other things, they're not looking at, in my judgment, these two fundamental issues. There are no easy answers. Take India. Ours is slightly different. We have seen the 146 members of parliament being suspended, and parties or the parliamentarians or state legislators taking a knee-jerk view, either supporting or opposing blindly on basis of party loyalty rather than fact and evidence. It's because of other factors. Parties have become totally autocratic. The members have no voice, so they follow the party bosses' diktats. If they don't follow, they have no political future, because the party bosses decide whether you will be a candidate for the next election, without which you are a nobody. B, we accentuated it further by very unthinking kind of anti-defection law, whereby if you oppose the party boss's diktat, even if you are right in logic and in fact, you will lose your office. And C, excessive centralization without any local government's role made the MLAs and MPs not legislators, but merely the local advocates to take care of the services locally, to satisfy the their customers, namely their voters, their constituency. It's not their job legally. That job should be the local governments to provide services. But if any MLA says that, that MLA or MP has no future. So you become disguised executors, a role that's not envisaged under the constitution or law, but a role you're forced to perform. On top of it, the electoral management, the cost of elections, illegitimate electioneering cost, has now run into tons of crores in many states. So most of the time of MLAs and MPs is, how do I find the money for the next election? Or how do I recoup the money that I've spent? So they become influence peddlers. So there are a lot of factors which are structural and institutional. We're not addressing them. And our own first past the post system with the Westminster model accentuated that. So within the nation state, it's easier to look at factors, and then if the leadership is both inspiring and logical and very rational, and harder because there is no transnational government. But I see the point. There's definitely greater volatility, greater polarization in politics within a country and perhaps across the world today, partly because of the technology and communication, and within nation states, partly because of the institutional failings which are not addressed adequately.
So, in the wake of increasing anti immigration sentiments and isolationist tendencies in various countries and also in the geopolitics, do you think the dynamics of globalization would change, and would these factors accelerate the process of deglobalization? And also, sir, how do you think the rise of anti immigration sentiments and the rapid development of technology in the world would play out for globalization?
Actually, these two are opposing forces. On the one hand, technology, which is transnational, nation states or societies have no power or control over it. On the other hand, the borders are national, therefore your sovereignty applies there. So two opposing forces are now at work. How will we create a framework in which the people's migration will be facilitated depending on the economic need and demographic balance rather than their prejudices? I wish I could give you an answer in the affirmative that in the next 10 years it will happen. My suspicion is it will happen in the next 100 years. Meanwhile, there will be a lot of confusion. Germany, for instance, embraced about 800,000 immigrants from Syria, etc., because of economic logic, because Germany requires young people. It's a manufacturing behemoth. Until China took over, became the number one manufacturer. Germany was the number one manufacturer earlier, you must remember. About a decade ago, Germany was number one manufacturer in the world, number one exporter in the world. So for a small country of 80 million people, it's a huge manufacturing machine. So they require a large number of manufacturing workers, and they have a superb institutional mechanism in place to train young people and skill them to be manufacturing workers. So Angela Merkel took a deliberate decision, apart from humanitarian considerations, an economic decision for Germany's prosperity. But she paid a humongous price. A person who was an unchallenged leader of the country, while she's still respected, she certainly lost a tremendous amount of political capital. It's a very hard decision. Elsewhere in the world, even that much has not been done because they could not absorb immigrants when they needed them. There's no mechanism in place to really utilize them in a productive way. Apart from all the insecurities and prejudices and religion, race, and so on and so forth. So we have a very complex situation. Will this get better? Not in the short term. But if we take a long-term trajectory, if some conditions are fulfilled, I would actually say when some conditions are fulfilled, because I believe it's more when than if. If much of the world comes to some kind of a stabilization of population, right now, Europe and America, there's a decline in population. America, immigrants and birth rates are okay, they're at least maintaining. But almost all of Europe, China, many other, Japan, East Asia, there's a decline in population. India is now at a stabilization level. Population will increase for some more time. Our fertility rates are already below 2 nationally. It's only going to get even less. And therefore, after some time, actually, once we reach a peak of, say, 1.6 billion population, chances are we'll have plateau and then declining population. Africa is going to increase up to 2.5 billion. It's now at 1 billion plus. It will actually rise by 2.5 times. But after that, it will also plateau and slowly decrease, because even in Africa, the fertility rates are falling, except that they are about 30, 40 years behind us. So once the stabilization is there and there's some kind of an understanding of where the demography is headed, some of the insecurities will diminish. Simultaneously, the countries which are losing population, they realize the desperate need for economic management of sensible migration. And two, if there is no desperation in migration, like yesterday, today, there's a lot of talk about a lot of people breaching the Mexico or America border and more or less invading America. Now, there is no way any country will be able to allow that. Otherwise, what is the nation state system about? What are borders about? What are laws of immigration about? So whatever we say from outside, it simply is not feasible. Because America opens its borders, all of us from India and much of Asia and Africa will move to America overnight. It simply is not a sustainable proposition, however much many people wish it. But when rather than if, world reaches a level of reasonable, not prosperity, but reasonable level of comfort, so that there's no desperation to move out of your geography for survival, then it will be much easier to manage migration. I think that's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years across the world. Already, many parts of the world are much more prosperous than they were earlier. Abject poverty, thanks to China and to some extent India, their governmental efforts is decreasing considerably. Much of the rest of the world will follow suit in the next 30, 40 years. So once these conditions are fulfilled, I think there will be greater balance and less of prejudice and hatred. And immigration will be much more sensible. It will never be perfect in the next 50, 100 years. 100 years later, maybe a transnational government is possible, a pan-global government. And maybe then more or less free borders may be available. But it will take a long time. It's not going to happen in the next few years. I don't see it happening.
So, also, given implications of artificial intelligence to disrupt labor markets, do you think it would harbor the anti immigration sentiments influencing the world migration trends, ultimately also impacting the trajectory of globalization?
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, the economic insecurities arising out of technological advances and change of the global manufacturing hubs. These two things are certainly going to impact domestic politics, attitudes to migration, attitudes to people of other nations or nationalities, inevitably. And nobody really knows what's going to happen. There are some people who argue that 70% of the jobs that your generation is going to hold 20, 30 years later, they have not yet been created. So in a fundamental sense, once we address the great challenge of poverty and deprivation in many poor countries, the global challenge for humanity is how are we going to employ everybody productively? It's not only an economic necessity, it's also a psychological necessity. Without productive employment, human beings become hollow, invisible, irrelevant, lacking in self-esteem, with all kinds of psychological and societal challenges. So how are we going to create employment to the bulk of the people when technology is inexorably moving in a direction where fewer and fewer people are producing more and more? This is a unique feature of our age. It was earlier, some glimpses were seen, that's how Luddites came. The moment manufacturing came, the Luddites feared that the traditional arts and crafts, they will lose employment, and therefore they went about breaking machines. But the small change compared to the kind of change that we are now witnessing or going to witness in the next few decades. The world is undergoing a kind of transformation that was never before witnessed with such breathtaking rapidity. And therefore, the whole economic management globally or within nation states, I don't know if I can even imagine. I can only sort of, have some conjectures, but nobody really knows. And it's a challenge that modern world has to deal with that. But the good news is overall prosperity is increasing. Overall, our sense of freedom is increasing. Our capacity to negotiate the complex world as individuals is increasing. But there is a fundamental global challenge 50 years hence of how are you going to employ the bulk of humanity productively, not only for their economic security, but for their psychological and social security. I think that's yet to be written.
So, shifting the debate now from a global perspective to an Indian perspective, and then further boiling it down to the state level, the recent state assembly elections showed a stark change in electoral outcomes. When we talk about the rejection of the old pension scheme in Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh, or rather the rejection of the government that was offering it, as well as the clear urban rural divide in Telangana, with Hyderabad having voted entirely different than the rest of the state. Do you think that we're at a point where competent governance, visible growth, service delivery, all of these factors are now trumping political ideology and populist and electoral promises?
Raisa, I'm an optimist, but I'm not that optimistic. Unquestionably, it's actually pretty impressive the way Hyderabad city responded differently. That means the economic interest, enlightened self-interest dominated the normal tribal loyalties of caste, region, religion, or even some amount of anger against the establishment because after 10 years in power with a semi-feudal kind of approach to governance, authoritarian, semi-authoritarian approach or high degree of centralization, they cause discomfort in the minds of citizens, inevitably. But enlightened self-interest, because there is a reasonable amount of growth which is felt within the city and surrounding areas of Hyderabad, it made people vote in one way. It's quite a remarkable thing. I don't think it happened anywhere else in the country so far. But it also means that the fruits of development are not reaching rural areas. Even if there is growth, because you cannot say there's no growth in rural Telangana. But the fruits of development have not yet reached the bulk of the ordinary people. I think it's an incredibly important lesson for our political system and economic system. That unless, along with promoting investment and growth in the big cities, I'm not opposed to that, none of us should be opposed to that, because they are, after all, beacons of and magnets of growth and talent. But unless small towns develop locally, promoting in situ urbanization without having to force the ordinary poor to migrate to distant cities with low level of skills and then have extremely unpalatable lives there, lives of great insecurity, miserable lives, unless you allow them to have a decent living locally, but in an urban setting, what President Kalam used to say, providing urban amenities in rural areas, he called it Pura. By whatever name you call, you require in situ urbanization with greater linkage between rural and urban areas, with basic amenities. Take today, for instance, television and mobile phone and internet to a large extent. These are available now across the country. Definitely telephone and television almost everywhere. Now, if you also make available water supply, sewerage, stormwater drainage, then sanitation and electricity and transport, and if you ensure quality education, quality health wherever people are, what more do you need? Why should people go to Delhi and Mumbai and Chennai and lead miserable lives at low income, with low skills, insecure lives, without any social support systems? That's the kind of urbanization we should imagine. Unfortunately, our ruling elites across the country have a very monarchical approach, an empire building approach. Wherever they are, the seat of power, the capital, also must be economic center, cultural center, social center. That's a dangerous approach. I think that's an important lesson that has to be followed. But otherwise, is India now safe from short-term impulses undermining long-term economic growth? Not yet. But there are some green shoots. And if we somehow create a mechanism by which within the next 10, 15 years at least there's reasonable growth, 6-7% minimum, and growth momentum continuing, infrastructure being built, and economic opportunities increasing because of investment, hopefully then we'll reach a tipping point. I don't think we have yet reached a tipping point. But there is hope. There is hope.
So, like you were saying, so these hints of instances that we're seeing where economic interest is trumping over tribal loyalties, do you think it's because we have reached or we're reaching a certain stage of development that has now sort of created an evolution in our democratic discourse, in our polity? Can it be attributed to our growth?
Partly. There's no doubt. Because if you entirely go by that, then Delhi should not have voted for Aam Aadmi Party. Delhi is India's most prosperous city with the highest per capita income. And yet Delhi voted for not only uh, a hope for a relatively clean government, but also a lot of individual short-term welfare measures, free water, free power, and so on and so forth. What it means is that unless you create conditions in which everybody, the poorest to the richest, get reasonable opportunity for vertical mobility, irrespective of the circumstances of birth, and that's what the constitutional mandate is. That's what a modern civilized state should do. That means creating basic infrastructure, rule of law, quality education, not free education alone. That is obvious, but so-called free education is not giving education in India. It's a joke. It's a tragedy. Quality education, because everybody has brains irrespective of the finances. And unless you allow the brains to flourish, to flower, there's no opportunity in a modern economy. And decent healthcare access without having to spend out of pocket. Unless these conditions are created, they're entirely achievable. They're eminently achievable. We have the resources, we have the technology, we have the human resources. We just don't have the will or the skill. If we do these things, then I think economic prosperity and political evolution, they'll go hand in hand. Until these things happen, mere economic prosperity, even if it happens on some scale, is not enough to safeguard our democracy.
Seeing how people have responded differently in the recent elections, as I mentioned, do you think we can say that the political class is still out of touch and are still tending to traditional methods and again going for populism for short-term needs? Is there a need for the political class to now evolve itself to be more in touch with what people of this nation need?
I have no doubt about it, you are right. In particular, the leadership. See, the average MLA or MP aspirant, you can't blame them because they have no power. They only have ambition. And they follow the traditional methods of vote buying. And then parties follow the short-term individual welfare measures. And of course, in the good old Indian tradition, a diverse society, divide people as much as humanly possible and mobilize them on caste lines, regional lines, religious lines, etc. We are doing all that to near perfection in this country. The leadership lost the imagination in the country. And in particular, the opposition today in India, there is much that is wrong with the governance process, whoever is in power. Where is education of quality? Where is healthcare of quality? Without education and healthcare of quality, how can productivity increase and how can poverty be eliminated? And without creating wealth, what do you want to distribute? Somehow pretending that you don't have to create wealth, but you can keep on distributing. It's nonsensical. What are you talking about? Where is it going to come from? How do you balance these both? And where is rule of law in the country? Whichever be the party in power at the union or state levels, we cannot even remotely claim that there is rule of law in India. Might is right in the country. And grassroots corruption in service delivery, though in terms of welfare, things have improved considerably. Last 10 years have been that way a watershed in terms of welfare delivery because without any leakage or corruption, now it's reaching the ordinary people in most states of India. That's good. But where the government actually had to provide proactively some services, there is monumental extortionary corruption on a daily basis. We are all victims of that. We all know that, except where technology has come into play. And where is transparency in government in this country? Right to Information Act, of which many of us were part and with great expectation we did that. In most states, Right to Information Act is more or less dead. So unless we focus on these and local governments, because local governments are schools for democracy. That is where the voter understands what is the meaning of the vote, how the vote is linked to her future, what happens to her family and her community. That is where you understand the link between the taxes you pay and the services you get. The authority you have given to the elected people and the accountability that is imposed on them. Unless that local governments really flourish, democracy is always in danger. It becomes an emotive exercise, it becomes impulsive exercise, it becomes caste-driven or money-driven. And that's a very dangerous thing. So, where is this agenda coming forth? Yes, governments are neglecting in state level, national level, because they're in power, enjoying power and getting bogged down in day-to-day issues. But what about the opposition? Where is the imagination? Where is leadership? Where is deeper constitutional understanding? So I think there is a deep failure in political leadership in the country. And MLAs and MPs or aspirants are actually They're victims. I don't think they individually are guilty. Because ours is not a system where legislatures decide anything. Ours is a system where the party bosses decide everything. Legislatures merely follow the diktats of the party bosses, partly because parties are entirely centralized, controlled by an individual or a family, partly because of the anti-defection law and other provisions. We actually made legislators irrelevant. They do anything but legislation.
So many are saying that in recent times there's been a bit of a surge with the government using state resources for autocratic purposes, like stifling democratic institutions such as the opposition or the media. For example, the large number of enforcement directorate or CBI investigations, along with using national security services to acquire and plant spyware on the personal devices of government critics. So, are these fears valid, and if so, to what extent?
These concerns are legitimate. But it's not merely about at one level or one tier. It's not merely union government. Take the rule of law. 98% of rule of law in India is at the state level. Most people don't realize it. Unlike the United States, where there are federal crimes and a federal judiciary and federal investigative system. In India, there's a unified judiciary and unified investigative system entirely under the state control, except the constitutional courts. And therefore, the failure of rule of law or perversion of rule of law is endemic in the country. Much of it is centered in the states. And the union also is now following suit. There's selective prosecution. Even if the people against whom investigative agencies are acting, even if you assume for argument's sake that it's on legitimate grounds, it is selective. That I think cannot be seriously disputed. As we discussed earlier, it is essentially a failure of rule of law. We never in our country institutionalized a framework of genuine rule of law. We talked about it normatively. But how will you institutionalize rule of law? The crime investigative agency must be effective, efficient, smart, and accountable, while being utterly independent and non-partisan. Today it's entirely dependent on political executive and therefore entirely driven by the partisan impulses of those in power. The local MLA most of the times actually calls shot in the local police station. It's not even the state government. Legislator is all powerful. Otherwise, he will get the inspector of police or the SHO transferred instantly, or even a superintendent of police on occasion. It's the reality of much of India. You take the superintendents of police transfers on average. In many states, every 6 months they get transferred. SHOs transfers. Unless you buy peace and do the bidding of the political masters, you have no survival. Forensics are extremely weak in India. In Delhi, in a highly talked about case, it took 1 year to get a DNA analysis done. In Delhi, national capital, in much talked about case, let alone the rest of the country. There's hardly any forensics. And third degree is habitually used against innocent, poor victims to extract confession. Prosecution is incredibly inefficient. We hardly pay attention to prosecution. It's utterly weak, inept. As a result of all these three, and the failings in the procedural law of the country, and the conduct of judiciary itself, because of incompetence and a certain casualness, multiple adjournments and trivial cases where the evidence is crystal clear. Conviction rate is, without confession, as close to 10 or 15% as possible. It's not even above 10-15%, but one of the lowest in the world. With confessions, it's approaching 25-30%. Tens of thousands are incarcerated in jails without a conviction, merely because they are too poor to pay the bail amount. So there is no justice system in India. There is no crime investigation which is independent in India. So unless you really look at the police, the prosecution, the forensics, the procedures, and the courts comprehensively, I don't think you can overcome this. It's not merely an individual or a party. Each time, whenever somebody is in power, when there's an obvious abuse of power or an alleged abuse of power, we focus attention. We are forgetting institutional factors. And the parties that criticize this abuse of power, they're not saying this is the alternative we provide. There's not even one word that says, look, when we come to office, this is what we're going to do in order to make sure that the police will not be slaves in our hands. They're not saying that. They're only complaining that they're slaves in your hands. Let me take power and they'll be slaves in my hands. I'll use that power now against you. No, that is not democratic politics. So it's a deeper crisis than an individual abusing power. There's no question about it. Some of the other things sometimes are exaggerated, sometimes well. But in general, I think there is a serious failure of rule of law. And without that, it's not the parties, it's not a fight between this party and that party, it's the ordinary citizens. We are not getting what is due to us in an otherwise sensible system of rule of law. And therefore, we have given up. And that's the reason why in India, the civil cases are far outnumbered by the criminal cases. In any modern economy, when there's a dispute, you go to court. In India, we refuse to go to court because we know nothing will happen. There's no point spending money. We'd much rather go to a Gonda, pay money. He will settle the dispute by rough and ready methods, or to a politician or a policeman, or suffer injustice silently and ignore. Now, that's not a good society, and that's also inimical to economic growth. So, we must look at it much deeper than politics. It is fundamental to society's stability, harmony, a sense of justice, and economic growth. And until we realize that as a society and as a political system, I think our economic growth ultimately will be stifled by failure of rule of law.
I see. So, on that point, do you think that the recent legislative omission of sedition law from the three criminal law bills is a sign of a change for the better?
Krishna, wording we may dispute whether sedition is the word right word to be used or not. Look at the American debate right now. Insurrection. The 14th Amendment to American Constitution after Civil War incorporated, it says that if an individual participates in insurrection against the American state or American Constitution, then the person should be disqualified for public office. So Donald Trump, is he qualified or not, is a challenge now. Probably it will be revealed in the next few weeks or months. So what does it mean? That there has to be a standard beyond the traditional crime of killing somebody or stealing some money or robbing somebody. If the constitutional order is sought to be overthrown by unconstitutional methods, should that or should that not constitute a crime? I think the balance of convenience lies in regarding that as a crime. If we think anything goes and vote can sanctify any kind of behavior in those in power or out of power, then society is not safe. Therefore, I think there is a reason why you require some mechanism by which insurrection and violent overthrow of the constitutional order have to be recognized as serious crimes and deal with them. But if you use that routinely, then I think we're undermining our own national security and constitutional order. The problem of India is not that there are certain laws which may be necessary, and certainly they require amendments, the wording can be improved. Sedition typically is associated with the notion of kingship. So we don't have to use such words. But insurrection, violent overthrow of the constitutional order, or even a non-violent overthrow of the fundamental constitutional order by conspiracy, you cannot ignore that. It's a crime.
So, can we see the recent mass suspension of the opposition MPs as an extension of the whole autocratic shift that many people are suggesting?
See, we always see the things near to us as very big and forget with time what actually happened earlier. We have been having this kind of an approach for the past 40 years at least. Probably 50 years, closer to 50 years than 40 years. And it is a structural issue. First, we have embraced the Westminster model, where there is a fusion of the executive with the legislature. Whereas theoretically and actually in reality, who are the only people elected in the country by us? Whom are the people of India transferring sovereignty? It's only to legislators at the state or national level. And theoretically, because in reality local governments are utterly feeble and powerless, the local representatives, these are the only people whom we the people are directly electing. So the only transfer of power from the people to elected representatives is through these people. That is theory. But in a Westminster model, the moment the majority forms a government and government commands a majority as long as it survives, the legislature has become now the tool of the executive. It is inherent in the model itself. Now in the West, Britain they had it. Many other Westminster model countries they have it. But they built other institutions and practices and traditions over centuries to mitigate that. The committees work very strongly. There are parliamentary practices followed by both sides. The Speaker's office is absolutely firm, powerful, and neutral. You have no doubt about that. And whether individual members or parties, they have their say, X amount of time is allocated to them. These are all absolutely strong traditions. In India, we never institutionalized them. On top of it, we brought in the anti-defection law. We made the legislators the slaves of the party bosses. And blind opposition, mindless opposition or support, depending on what the party boss told you, not because you are a legislator elected by the people to represent the people's aspirations and your own judgment. There is zero judgment. A parliament or state assembly today is reduced to a loy jirga. I don't even understand why we should meet. Because already what you vote for, whom you vote for, how you vote is decided by the constitutional amendment. The party dictate is inviolable, otherwise you will lose office. You see Justice Ramaswamy impeachment case, way back in 1993. It failed because a whip was issued to prevent impeachment. You see the Muslim women's law. A terrible law was enacted because a whip was imposed. Many members of the Congress party in parliament opposed it, but they knew it was wrong, including the present governor of Kerala. They had to give up their political careers. You see the 64th Amendment introduced by Rajiv Gandhi in 1989 about the local governments. The model is flawed, but the idea is very sound. Despite a massive majority in Lok Sabha, that amendment was defeated by opposition coming together merely because they happened to be in opposition. You see the farm laws. I always said it before and I maintain that now. They're extremely sound laws. Of course, the government bungled by not bringing about a compromise, a consensual approach. But the laws, every economist of any note, every person who understands agricultural economy and agriculture, farming, they all know it's necessary. They're not sufficient. And there's blind opposition, both in parliament and on the street, to the detriment of Indian agriculture. So you see this kind of an approach, which is unrelated to the merits of the case. Whatever be the merits, logic and evidence. If I am in ruling party, I support it blindly. If I am in opposition party, I oppose it blindly. Then why at all parliament? So there's a deeper crisis than suspension of XYZ. And the committee system doesn't work. There's no committee system worth mentioning. It is there in parliament on token, but there's no real empowerment. Woodrow Wilson said about American Parliament, American Congress, he said Congress in session is Congress and exhibition. Congress in committees is Congress at work. We've forgotten that. In the states, though, committees don't matter at all. Other than some committees in state legislature, they are all namesake committees. Even the members don't take them seriously. And local governments are dead. In the absence of local governments, empowered local governments, the MLA's role, MP's role is to become the local government de facto, without the de jure power. So all his time is consumed in pleasing the constituencies to make sure the water supply is there, the drainage is there, the street light is functioning. Is that why we elected the legislator at the state and national level? And finally, electoral system. Crores of rupees spent illegitimately to get elected. So the poor MLA's time is influence peddling. How do I now raise money? How do I make money to make good the losses or expenditure I got? And for the next election. So if you don't look at these things, if you make it party political, then a lot of noise will be generated, a lot of heat will be generated without any light. We must introspect. This is a much deeper, long-term crisis. Our legislatures are dysfunctional. Our democracy is messy, highly centralized. But our democracy is still robust because there are still free elections. There are still political freedoms. We must use these two tools and hopefully some amount of honest introspection and genuine search for solutions on the part of the political parties and their bosses to actually resolve the dilemmas rather than blaming each other and making it a warfare on a daily basis.
Thank you.
So now let's move to something more cheerful. So one big reason to cheer this year has been the state of the Indian economy. So yes, we can do much better, but in the global scheme of things with an unsupportive global environment, we seem to have done reasonably well. And we are one of the lone bright spots in the world. So do you think like now it's fair to say that we are actually at the cusp of economic greatness?
let's not get ahead of ourselves, but there are definitely a lot of positive features. For instance, the banks, which are about a decade ago in deep distress, 12 to 15% non-performing assets, basically defaults. Now at the lowest level of default level, they are very healthy. But that cost us 5 lakh crores plus of taxpayers' money going into the banks. That means your and my hard-earned money has gone to cover up the misdeeds of those in power in the country. Instead of going for better education, better healthcare, better infrastructure. We should not be happy about that. We should never forget that. Infrastructure is really being built pretty well. You could complain here and there, but on the whole, there's no doubt. There's an atmosphere which is encouraging investment and entrepreneurship in the country, both global and Indian. And there is technology upgradation in a variety of sectors. All these are very welcome features. And technology is now being deployed effectively for delivery of welfare without corruption or leakage, which was unheard of. Earlier, almost every planning commission document, every debate in the country is how do you identify the beneficiaries and how do you make sure that there's no leakage. And today, I think we have done significantly better. There's still a lot of unfinished agenda. So these are all good news. And hopefully, if we allow this trajectory to continue, and if there's some fiscal prudence, if we realize that borrowed money cannot be utilized for short-term expenditure, welfare, for instance, or salaries and pensions, interest payments must be met from the current revenues, and borrowed money must be for the future investment to benefit the next generation. If that basic discipline is followed, then I think we're reasonably safe, but still there are caveats. One, as I mentioned already, fiscal prudence. Increasingly in many states, take Karnataka recently, the election, Telangana, the political parties are feeling compelled to resort to short-term individual welfare measures which are beyond their means at the cost of the next generation. The intergenerational equity is affected. That means to meet their short-term political requirements, they're willing to destroy the next generation. Now, no family behaves like that. Indian families, whatever be the caste or region or religion, we all love our children to death. We're willing to die in order to protect our children's future. That is what India is, in the large part. Our governments are behaving as if the children's lives are irrelevant. We somehow have to survive today at the cost of tomorrow. Now, this has to be curbed. Whether the old pension system offered in several states, and some states embraced it, or the short-term welfare measures going way beyond control, and therefore a lot of debt has to be incurred in order to simply meet the welfare expenditure and the day-to-day expenditure. This must be curbed. The second is, we have to improve the quality of education and skills and healthcare and productivity. After a point, and today we are still at the early stages of economic growth, therefore the skill deficit is not being felt adequately, though many employers already tell us, where are the employees to be hired? You have degrees, fancy degrees, but there's no skill really. That is true in India. Even a small organization like us to big multinationals, they all feel the skill deficit in India. Look at Chinese productivity, look at India's productivity. We want to be next China. Without Chinese infrastructure, Chinese stability, and Chinese productivity, how are you going to be next China? It's not going to happen by a miracle, by magic. So of that, productivity, quality education, genuine educational outcomes and skills, and healthcare. I think India is woefully inept in this. We are among the worst among large economies in the world. Third is, while politics of our kind promotes some degree of polarization, the political leadership across the country in all parties must be wise enough to bury the hatchet on fundamentals and say, we will not make everything an issue of contention. There are certain given things we all accept and embrace. Other issues we'll fight, fiercely ideological battles, but we will not make everything a life or death issue. So some wisdom is required. So these three things, if we take care, then I think we have good days. In my judgment, next 10 to 15 years are the most critical phase to overcome the political challenges in the country. And if we overcome them for 15 years, hopefully there will be enough of substance and economic growth to impact the lives of the bulk of the people, that the people will then take care. Right now, we are still not at that stage. We are still in potential danger of a verdict or another derailing economic growth because of people's anger or emotion.
So in the next 10 to 15 years then, so a lot of different views have come about that suggest different roadmaps to be followed to achieve economic greatness. So for instance, Raghuram Rajan talks about how we should favor services over manufacturing, or Arvind Panagaria talks about how free trade is the way to combat poverty and grow richer for any nation. But there are also, on the other hand, prominent voices that talk about how you need to protect local players from like the global giants. So, what would your roadmap be, sir, for India to follow?
Let's take these two issues, manufacturing versus services. I think it is a wrong kind of a debate. India is not a tiny country with 7 million population or 5 million population. We are not an Israel or a Singapore. There is no way India can depend on one sector. Our economy is already diversified. It must be diversified even more. There is not a product in the world that India should be incapable of doing. Now, to what extent can India really show progress depends on the global forces and our own capacity. It must not be for want of ambition and effort. Look at China. Today, everybody knows globally there are two giants in aircraft manufacturing, either Airbus in Europe or Boeing in America. I actually was in Seattle visiting the Boeing manufacturing shop floor. It's a massive enterprise. Now, China is so audacious and so ambitious. Now, their indigenous manufacturing company or companies for aircrafts are now doing so well that most of the Chinese domestic requirements are going to be met by that. And China is a huge economy. And given China's propensity to really excel in any area that they focus on and compete globally, like for instance, take that BYD, that electric car. Now this year is expected to overtake Tesla in terms of the number of cars manufactured and exported, which nobody would have believed 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So China is not saying, no, my God, no, already Boeing is there, Airbus is there, how can we compete? No. A country of 1.43 billion people, 18% of humanity, our aspirations and opportunities cannot afford to give up on any sector. To what extent we will reach depends on how well we do. But if we ab initio give up and say we can't be good in manufacturing, you give it up, it's absurd. The right approach is how do we promote, along with high-tech and high-value products in manufacturing, the low-tech, low-skilled things in order to provide employment to the tens of millions of unorganized workers. 82% of our 550 million workers are in the unorganized sector. And they're leading very precarious lives, not knowing where the next month's income will come or next day's income will come sometimes. We worked ourselves to create jobs in the unorganized sector which are more secure, with better living conditions, better working conditions. But we have failed to do so. Take, for instance, the garment sector. India produces as much of cotton as China. Some years we are ahead, some years they are ahead. And China has 4 to 5 times our GDP and therefore GDP per capita. China is high up the value chain because they started their enterprise, their effort earlier, and they're way ahead of us. And that's why, whether airplane manufacturing or the electric cars, they are now close to being global leaders or globally competitive, apart from many other areas. And yet, China exports annually about $325 billion worth of garments, employing tens of millions of people. How much does India export? With such massive unemployment problem and a large number of unorganized workers, 40 billion. Why? Because we have bad politics and bad governance, bad priorities. There's one company in Achutapuram near Vizag, Anakapalli district. A Sri Lankan entrepreneur or entrepreneurs, they came and established it there. They employed 22,000 women from hundreds of neighboring villages in garment making. They're not getting fabulous salaries. They're getting 15,000, 20,000 rupees salaries. But they're getting a secure, dignified work environment and a decent wage related to local conditions. There's not a single woman in a radius of about 50, 60, 100 kilometers who wants to be employed who is unemployed. That is true transformation. So, in manufacturing, if we say the accent should be also, in addition to what we are doing in terms of your production incentive, etc., extend it also to the low-skill, large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing, I'm all in favor. take care of the unorganized sector, I'm all in favor. And create local magnets, small towns, I'm all in favor. Integrate rural economy and agriculture with industry, I'm all in favor. But ignore manufacturing, it's an absurd notion by any standard. We need everything and anything. There is no way India can give up on any sector. If there is any possibility, we must get into it, do as best we can, upgrade our skills, employ more people, export as much as we possibly can. We can't force anybody to buy our goods. We have to be competitive. Yeah. But the only thing is, you cannot have policies, and that comes to the second one, the trade barriers and tariffs and so on and so forth. There is no country on earth which opted for complete free trade from the beginning or throughout. America, which was a champion of free trade, is now a champion of domestic protection. Each country protects its own interests. Overall, free trade is better for everybody, particularly for the consumers. But there is a clash between the producers' interests and the consumers' interests. And ultimately, producers are consumers. If too many producers lose their jobs and therefore incomes, there are no consumers and there is no market demand. And if we export all jobs and all manufacturing, all agricultural production to only other countries which are more competitive for the time being, then you have nothing else to produce. You can't be a parasite and a basket case. Therefore, reasonable protection for a limited period of time without undermining the long-term export competitiveness. So 3 points I made: reasonable protection, limited period of time, without undermining export competitiveness in the long term, with an intention to promote export competitiveness may be necessary, but we must not go overboard. There's a danger of protection becoming increasingly insular, and then the players who are benefiting insisting on the protection forever to the detriment of the country. That must be guarded against. Therefore, Dr. Panagarya's point is very valid. But if India alone is expected to be a free trader, when the rest of the world is protecting itself and its economy and its workers, it's unrealistic. We are in the global nation-state competition. While we have to be part of the global community in trade, as in other respects, we also have to protect our country within reasonable limits with these 3 caveats I mentioned.
So now, given what we've spoken about, and also next year is going to be a big year for India with the general elections and everything. So what are your expectations from 2024, and what would you like to see happen in India and across the world?
Across the world is too big for us. But in India, what we discussed, whichever be the government, if there is a broad consensus and agreement and a policy framework in which the growth will be sustained, growth with employment, the growth stimulus, a hospital environment to promote investment, global or Indian, and infrastructure creation in order to make it happen, and the fiscal prudence required in order to protect the economy for the future, that more and more capital investment and keeping the revenue expenditure under control, no revenue deficits. I think this fiscal framework and pro-growth framework, we must have a broad consensus that this will not be breached. Right now, there is a danger. We are viewing growth as different from welfare and the political management. You cannot have that view. It's a dangerous view. We have to all agree on that. So whatever happens, let us hope that the growth momentum and investment climate will not suffer, and fiscal prudence will be brought into the prime of place. The second is education and healthcare. All political parties across the country, except some work in the margins, the short-term populist measures, the real improvement of education and healthcare outcomes is simply not taking place. It's not expenditure alone that matters. Education is spending a lot of money. More money is not needed. Wiser expenditure. Focusing on outcomes rather than enrollment. Enrollment we are doing 100%. It's not the length of the classroom that matters. It is a child's brain, to what extent the child is flowered, to what extent the child's potential is fulfilled, to what extent her life is going to be better because of education, irrespective of circumstance of birth. And can we provide, given the opportunities that we have in the country, quality healthcare to everybody without out-of-pocket expenditure? These are 2 perfectly realistic dreams, well within our reach. If we don't do that, governance has no meaning. Anywhere in the world, particularly in a poor country like ours, a country with inequalities of caste, region, religion, etc., they're absolutely critical. The third is rule of law. Again, all parties are united in that they don't want rule of law. They only want their rule, not the other fellow's rule. That's all. Now we have to change that. It cannot happen overnight dramatically, but step by step. We discussed today, for instance, the police, the prosecution, the forensics, the procedures, and the courts, and so on and so forth. What needs to be done? If we don't focus, that means we have no respect for ourselves. We want to live in a jungle Raj, where the might is right. It's a shame to call ourselves a modern democracy if we continue those practices. Finally, local empowerment. If local governments are not sensibly empowered with accountability, our democracy will never mature. It will be always a hit and miss thing. It's too risky. We can't afford that. People must be enabled to understand what the vote actually means. They must be allowed to commit mistakes and learn from others' experience and improve things and allow leadership to grow. Because local governments are schools for democracy. So I think if these, and along with the local urbanization and local development, I'm clubbing both these. If this much is done, I don't want to ask for too much. I think we should be very, very happy. If half of it is done, as long as we protect economic growth, we are still reasonably safe, but not safe enough.
Absolutely, sir. And we will all do our bit to make this happen. So with this, it's a wrap on this special year-end review with Dr. JP. Thank you for joining us, Dr. JP. And on to all the viewers also, thank you for tuning in. And on behalf of Team FDR, I'd like to wish you all a very happy new year. And may we all race towards our goals with great fervor and momentum like the Indian economy. Thank you.